Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. What made me love the Star Wars prequels as a kid growing up was simple: the world of Coruscant. When Anakin and the Jedi first travel there in Phantom Menace and glide over the towering skyscrapers of the planet-wide city, I was blown away by the sheer scale of everything. On Coruscant, the gap in between buildings continues down for several miles, hiding endless possibilities for adventure and exploration. It's the one place in the Star Wars galaxy that I would enjoy visiting the most, and hopefully someday soon we'll return there once again, instead of going to Tatooine for the 10th time. Deserts are cool, but once you've seen one, you've seen them all. Now, Coruscant has grown into what it is because it's the economic and also cultural center of the galaxy. The actual physical centers of the galaxy are usually full of black holes and radiation, not a great place to live. It was also said that the best species in Star Wars history, humans, also call Coruscant their home, and it's from there they started expanding outwards towards the rest of the galaxy. First in generation ships, and then by carving and mapping out hyperspace lanes. By the time the Galactic Republic was in full swing, every hyperspace lane led back to Coruscant, and every major power that took over the galaxy called Coruscant its capital. Until the New Republic, that is, and, well, we all know how that went. Now, Coruscant presents some very unique problems for both the defenders of the planet and any potential attackers. And so today we'll be looking at some of the unique challenges that combatants battling on Coruscant will face by looking at some of the major battles that have actually taken place on this planet. 200,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, Coruscant was actually a two-species planet known by the locals as Neutron. The TAUNG were one species. They were warlike and a bit stronger and larger than your average human being, but they were outnumbered by the other species on the planet known as the ZHELL. Although there's not that much information left on the ZHELL anymore, most historians agree that the ZHELL were probably either humans or some kind of predecessor race of humanity. These ZHELL were organized into 13 nations, and they were united in their cause against the TAUNG. During one TAUNG offensive against the main capital of ZHELL, a massive volcanic eruption blanketed the skies and created panic amongst the ZHELL ranks. But ultimately, the ZHELL regrouped and then managed to kick the TAUNG off of the planet. The TAUNG would go on to found a small little warrior race known as the Mandalorians. Now, what's really important about the ZHELL victory is that it essentially united the entire planet, destroyed the idea of nation states, and created this unity which would ultimately let Coruscant grow into what it would become. This would be the beginning of Coruscant's rise from just another primitive world to a planet full of skyscrapers. By 90,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Galactic City had started building a vertical city with multiple layers, and by 24,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, Coruscant's last piece of undeveloped land was covered in buildings, making the planet officially a Ecumenopolis. Now, what's really interesting about Coruscant is despite its importance in the galaxy, it never really fielded massive defenses either on the surface of the planet or in orbit. Coruscant was never defended by a planetary shield. Such an obstacle would restrict movement, which would kill trade and commerce. Even when known threats such as the enemy fleets of the TAUNGs or Alsicans were detected en route to the planet, Coruscant usually just relied on their own defensive fleet to intercept. The leaders of Coruscant always had this commerce and economy first mentality. They sought to use Coruscant's considerable wealth and political connections to force alliances and negotiate truces to prevent any damage to the core planet. And for most of galactic history, Coruscant avoided being a major battleground. What skirmishes that did occur were usually limited to only portions of the planet or space battles, and they never lasted very long. And as the Old Republic expanded into the Mid-Rim and then eventually Outer Rim, it ultimately would become too large for any other faction to seriously challenge. There were, of course, rebellions and insurgent activities, hostile factions, but these were limited to the border regions of the Republic. And thousands of years of dominance and economic stability meant that the Republic never really focused too much on creating a powerful military to defend Coruscant. Usually when an upstart faction like the heavily militarized Mandalorians came to power, Coruscant would slowly absorb losses in its border regions and wait to upgrade their military to meet new threats. Coruscant basically had the entire weight of the galaxy in between them and any other potential enemy, so they rarely were ever worried about any attacks. The Sith Empire was the first true power that could actually rival the Old Republic in size and military force. During the Great Galactic War between these two factions, the Sith Empire actually planned on targeting Coruscant because it was really a symbol of democracy in the Old Republic. The Sith Empire had gradually been pushing the less militarized Galactic Republic back across the galaxy and towards its core regions. Although the Sith numbers and resources were limited when compared to the Old Republic, their entire economy and government focused on creating a massive fleet, and skilled soldiers filled their ranks. The Sith Empire eventually called for a ceasefire, and the Republic, which was losing battle after battle, was more than willing to accept any kind of negotiations, and so they held negotiations on Alderaan. But as the diplomats were still in the middle of talking about pre-existing conditions before the negotiations even started, a group of Sith warriors managed to sneak onto the planet of Coruscant and take over the Jedi Temple and deactivate the planet's defensive grid. What ensued was known as the sacking of Coruscant. Sith reinforcements arrived over the planet and routed the Republic defense fleet and began deploying soldiers onto the ground. Within hours, they had control over the Galactic City, which is where most of the government buildings in Jedi Temple were located. They blocked all communications off-world and blockaded any ship from coming and leaving the planet. Despite their very successful and brilliant attack on Coruscant, which essentially routed all defense forces around the planet, the Sith never had the illusion that they would be able to hold onto Coruscant, and neither did most sane military leaders, even young Sith lords like the ones that were in charge of this operation. Instead, the Sith used the communication blackout and sacking of Coruscant to take control of the negotiations that were going on in Alderaan, which eventually led to the very favorable Treaty of Coruscant. This ended the Great Galactic War, and the Sith would return Coruscant to the Republic. In return, they would be allowed to keep many of the different planets they had captured in their massive offensive in the earlier years of the war. The entire treaty was seen as very controversial all throughout the Republic, and it actually set the stage for a very brutal and long Cold War. You see, the population on Coruscant at the time was over 1 trillion. The census wasn't even able to accurately count everyone on the planet, and it probably never was because it mainly used population density to calculate things, and the reality is that in the lower levels of the planet, some 5,000 stories down, no one really knew what was going on down there. Even when the planet wasn't under occupation, the local Coruscant security forces only had control of the upper levels. The further down you went, the less of a government presence there was, and the more monsters there usually were. In the event of an occupation, it was very easy for insurgents or opposition forces to just disappear into the depths of Coruscant, which made occupying this planet extremely costly and basically impossible. And even the Sith Empire wouldn't do something as crazy as bombard Coruscant into submission from orbit. The planet was so interconnected with the galactic economy that any major disruptions or damage to the world could cause a massive ripple across the entire galaxy, disrupting supply chains and local markets with devastating effect. Later on, as Palpatine carried out his contingency plan where he essentially started destroying worlds in order to create chaos, even he avoided damaging Coruscant. Now, during the Clone Wars, we once again see the enemies of the Republic lead their fleets away from the core and carry out a somewhat surprising attack against Coruscant. As usual, the Coruscant home defense fleet was ill-equipped and not really prepared to fight off a massive invasion force. This is probably due to the fact that Republic leaders didn't believe that the Confederacy of Independent Systems would be bold enough to actually attack the capital. And so the CIS was able to do massive damage against the Coruscant defenders with a relatively small fleet. Again, the CIS were under no illusion that they could take over Coruscant. The entire naval action that they had carried out above orbit was just a cover for a ground attack force that was focused on one thing: capturing Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, which they actually managed to do successfully. But the problem with any attack on Coruscant, even ones that have a very limited and realistic goal, like the ones the CIS did, is the fact that Coruscant is on every major hyperspace line. So even though the Coruscant home defense fleet was basically destroyed and overwhelmed, the Open Circle fleet was only a few systems away and ready to come to Coruscant's rescue, which is exactly what it did. If you take a look at a map of the galaxy, not only were there several major worlds in the vicinity with their own defense fleets, you could pretty much get to Coruscant from anywhere in the galaxy relatively quickly. which means that a fight against Coruscant quickly becomes a battle against the entire Republic. And opposition factions that fought against the Republic, whether it be the Sith Empire or CIS, usually lack the resources and will to secure Coruscant and actually make that fight happen. Now, there were a few successful transfers of power on Coruscant, and one happened during the rise of the New Order. Aside from some dissidents holding up in the Jedi Temple, the planet more or less switched from the Republic to the Empire peacefully. Then, at the end of the Galactic Civil War, there was a much more gradual but violent takeover by the Alliance to restore the Republic. For most of the Galactic Empire's reign, prosperity and economic stability kept the people of Coruscant happy and distracted. Even after the destruction of Alderaan and Yavin 4 escalated the Galactic Civil War into an actual shooting war, the people of Coruscant were kind of in a bubble and insulated from the problems affecting the rest of the galaxy. But after the death of Emperor Palpatine, the Empire began falling apart and the military fractured into smaller pieces that were controlled by regional government leaders like Moffs and governors, or by high-ranking military leaders. Confusion swept across the galaxy. In some systems, there were rumors that the Emperor had died. In other systems, all communications were basically blocked out. The thing is, the Emperor glued everything together with his authority, which inspired a lot of fear, but once he was gone, everything, including the basic logistical structure that kept the galaxy functioning, fell apart. On Coruscant, Grand Vizier Mas Amedda took control of what remained of the central government, although he was really nothing more than just a puppet, and his authority didn't even expand beyond the Imperial Center District of the city, let alone the entire Empire. The Imperial Security Bureau more or less took command of the defense of the Imperial Center, and as food and essential supplies began running out, riots erupted across the entire city. The ISB and local police cracked down hard on dissidents by basically just massacring people and opening fire on crowds, which started an even more intense planet-wide rebellion. Mas Amedda, being the coward he is, actually tries to surrender to the New Republic, but they refuse to accept his surrender because they don't really believe he's in charge of anything. Eventually, the Galactic Concordance Treaty was signed and order was finally restored to the planet. But even so, the New Republic elected for the first time in thousands of years to establish their capital outside of Coruscant. Perhaps they were worried about Imperial sympathizers hiding in the ruins of the city. Perhaps they just wanted a clean start and wanted to separate themselves from the previous government. The first New Republic capital was located on Chandrila and then later changed to Hosnian Prime, which ultimately was destroyed by the First Order. Given the importance of Coruscant to the galaxy, one has to wonder what would have happened had the New Republic placed their capital on Coruscant instead. Now that we know that the First Order was essentially controlled by Palpatine, it's very likely that the Sith Lord would have spared Coruscant. After all, the Imperial Palace was built on a great nexus of dark side energy. So as you can see, even the most ambitious leaders in Star Wars history refused to try to take over Coruscant. It was just simply too much work, and it really wasn't worth it. Well, that is until the Yuzheng Vong came along, but they were just basically extreme fanatics, and they thought in a very different way from everyone else. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.